Hello, and welcome to this lesson on EC2 Container Service, otherwise known as ECS. So over here in the Orion papers, let's click on our account, then under Compute, and then under ECS here. Over here on the AWS console, you can find the EC2 Container Service under Compute here by clicking on EC2 Container Service. Now, if this is the first time that you're using EC2 Container Service, you can go ahead and click on Get Started and then click on Cancel here. And this is just going to bring us to the main area of the ECS console. And we can see here we can switch between our clusters, task definitions, and repositories. Now, it's important to understand that this is not going to be an introductory course on containers or on Docker. This is going to be a lesson on the ins and outs and the fundamentals of the EC2 Container Service and how that works. So if you're unfamiliar with Docker or containers, then I suggest that you certainly go and find another course that we offer here on Linux Academy or Cloud Assessments, which can help fill you in on containers and Docker and how they both work. And again, the purpose of this lesson is going to explain the essentials of ECS and some of its main components, and also some of its most applicable use cases. But first, what we want to learn about is ECS Essentials. So what exactly is ECS? Well, ECS, or EC2 Container Service, is a container management service that supports Docker. Now, Docker is the leading container service that is available currently in the IT marketplace. So you're going to hear the term Docker used almost synonymously with containers. Now, Docker is just one way of managing containers, but again, it is the most widely used. So the fact that ECS supports Docker is very important because, again, it is just one of the most widely used ways of managing and implementing containers inside of your environment. So also with ECS, it allows you to easily create and manage a fleet of Docker containers on a cluster of EC2 instances. So the two main things you need to know about ECS is that it is a container management services that supports Docker, and it allows you to easily create and manage a fleet of Docker containers on a cluster, meaning just a whole bunch of EC2 instances. So why do you want to use ECS, or why use containers in general? Well, the first and probably most important reason is that it allows you to create distributed application and microservices. So you can create application architecture comprised of independent tasks or processes, or otherwise known as microservices. For example, you can have separate containers for various components of your application. So you can have one container for your web server component of your application, another container for the application server, another container for the message queue, another container for your backend servers. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to decouple or distribute your application across various different components or different containers, so you can then manage each one of those containers individually. So what this allows you to do is to start, stop, manage, monitor, and scale each container independently. So instead of having to scale your entire application if traffic is increasing or usage is increasing on your application, you can just scale the specific containers that are getting hit with the most amount of traffic. And then it also allows you to, again, monitor each container independently of each other. So it allows you to more easily monitor and understand the type of traffic and usage that various components of your application is receiving. Another use case for containers is batch and ETL jobs. So you can package batch and ETL jobs into containers, and you can deploy them into shared EC2 clusters. You can also run different versions of the same job or multiple jobs on the same cluster. You can also share cluster capacity with other processes and/or grow jobs dynamically on demand to improve resource utilization. So if you really understand the way that containers work, is it allows you to share resources on the exact same server. So you can have one server that's running several different containers, and you can share resources of that underlying hardware across multiple containers. So it allows you to share compute resources across different containers, which will allow you to use less resources, therefore saving you money. Also, another use case is for continuous integration and deployment. So by using Docker image versioning, you can use containers for continuous integration and deployment. The build process can pull, build, and create a Docker image that can be deployed into your containers. This allows you to avoid an application from working in a developer environment and not working in a production environment, because the Docker daemon is the same across all environments. So now that we know a little bit about what ECS is and what some of the main use cases are, the reasons why you want to use ECS or containers for your applications, let's take a look at how ECS actually works. So what is the actual workflow? So let's take a look at our diagram here. And here what we have is we have our VPC. We have two availability zones inside of our VPC. And then what we have here are our clusters, or EC2 clusters, which is basically just a logical grouping of EC2 instances that are going to be working together to handle ECS or to work with your containers. And it all starts outside of our ECS service here with a Docker file. So what exactly is a Docker file? So a Docker file is a plain text file or a script that specifies all of the components that are included in a container. So basically, it's all the instructions for what will be placed inside a given container. So this is just going to be all the instructions indicating what type of software, files, libraries, dependencies should be included in a particular container. So again, it's just a plain text file with the instructions outlining everything that should be included in a container. So a Docker file is then used to create a container or Docker image. Now, the Docker image or container image is built from the Docker file. And the container or Docker image contains all of the downloaded software code, runtime, system tools, and libraries as outlined in the Docker file. So the Docker file is the instructions for everything that needs to be included, and the Docker file is the actual file itself, which contains then all of those downloaded pieces of information. So all the downloaded software code, runtime, system tools, and libraries. So this defines what should be inside of the Docker or container image, and then the container image contains all of that software. So then once you have a container or Docker image, you then need to put that somewhere. So that's put in what is called a container registry. So a container registry is a repository where container or Docker images are stored and accessed from when needed. So a container registry can be located on AWS via the ECR service or EC2 Container Registry. So AWS has their own repository that can be used to store container or Docker images. You can also use a third-party repository like Docker Hub being one of the most popular container registry repositories, or you can always use your own self-hosted registry. So once you have created your Docker file and then created a container image or Docker image from the Docker file and placed them inside of a container registry, then the container itself is ready to be accessed and placed onto your fleet of EC2 instances. So how do you do that? Well, first you have to define what is called a task definition. So an ECS task definition is a JSON formatted text file that contains the blueprint for your application. And so this includes which container or Docker image to use, the repository, meaning the container registry the image is located in, which ports should be open on the container instance, and what data volume should be used with the container. So just like the Docker file provides the instructions for what needs to be downloaded and included in the container or Docker image, the task definition is just a set of instructions which is going to tell ECS where it should go to get the Docker file. So it's going to say, hey, here is the container registry that you need to go to. Then inside the container registry, it's going to say, go ahead and grab this container or Docker image. That is the Docker image that we're going to install or create our container from. It will also then have instructions about what ports to open for the container, and then also what data volumes to use with the container itself. So that is what is in the task definition. So again, these are all things that are outside of ECS. But now when we look into ECS itself, it contains a whole fleet, either one or a fleet of EC2 instances. And when it's a fleet, we call it a cluster. And then on each EC2 instance inside of the ECS cluster, there are two main components. There's an ECS agent and then tasks. So first, let's look at the ECS agent. So the ECS agent runs on each EC2 instance inside of the ECS cluster. It communicates information about the instances to ECS, including running tasks and resource utilization. The ECS agent is also responsible for starting and stopping tasks when instructed to by ECS. So the ECS agent is what will control when tasks get executed. And when a task is executed, it's following the instructions in the task definition. So the task is just the actual representation of the task definition on an EC2 instance inside of your container cluster. So the ECS agent will start and stop these tasks based on instruction and schedule by you through the ECS system. So again, to kind of recap on that, on the container side, first we need our Docker file. That's going to give us instructions of what should be inside of the container or Docker image. The Docker image is then stored inside of a container registry, which again can be either a third-party repository like Docker Hub, or more importantly for AWS, they have their own container registry system that is set up called ECR, which you can use if you so choose. We then have to set up a task definition, which will define things like what registry to pull our Docker file from, what Docker file we want to use, what ports to have open, and what data volumes to use. And then the ECS agent is what will actually be used to start, stop, and schedule the running of tasks. And the task is just the actual execution of a task definition inside of an EC2 instance or inside of your ECS cluster. So again, it's just important to understand that ECS is a Docker-compatible container management system, and it is primarily used to create distributed applications, allows you to break up your application into microservices, and be able to monitor and scale each of your containers independently. So each component or section of your application that you've broken up into those microservices, you can start, stop, monitor, scale each one independently. And through the diagram here in the Orion papers, it's important to understand the various components that make up ECS and how it works and how the workflow is organized so that when you actually get into ECS, you have an understanding of the components that are needed and the workflow to set up your containers. And with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.